The world is changing faster than you can imagine. The old systems are collapsing. Join us as we delve into the minds driving the future, the Clean Titans.
Welcome back to Clean Titans. We often interview technologists and founders, but today we have someone who understands the plumbing of the incumbent system better than almost anyone. Our guest spent 4 decades in the trenches of oil and gas and power, and now he is dedicated to disrupting that very system. He is Fraser Maywood, a management consultant, a professional director, and the current chair of Sustainable Energy Now in Australia. Fraser, welcome to Clean Titans.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks for having me on.
A pleasure. You have a unique resume. Former oil and gas executive, an engineer, and now a clean energy advocate. What was the exact moment or data point in your years that convinced you to leave the incumbent system and pivot to radical advocacy with SEN? What broke the linear thinking?
So about 10 years ago, I quit full-time work. We sold an engineering company and I stayed on afterwards for about a year. And then I went from full-time work to part-time work as a consultant. And when you're working part-time, you have a lot more time to look at other opportunities. And about that time, my kids were at school looking at climate action. And there was a movement called School Strikes for Climate. And we had a discussion as a family. And I decided, well, climate change is real. We need to support the kids. And the kids went on a march. I got interested to see who was on the march, what they were doing. And I was just curious about how these activists worked. What is that drives them? How do they get out in the streets? And what their theory of change is. How do they think getting arrested will bring about change? So as an engineer, you're always curious about areas that you don't know about. And that's how I got involved slowly, initially with activism, understanding how it was meant to work, and then involved in advocacy. So in advocacy work, I could use my engineering and management skills to better understand how to bring about change as an advocate rather than as an activist. So by accident, Ali, that's how it came about, as most things do, curiosity and accidents.
Most good things start that way, right?
Correct.
Your specialty is risk management. When you look at the financials of incumbent energy companies today, what is the single greatest unhedged risk that their boards are currently running?
Yeah.
Is it stranded assets or something else, like talent flight or social license?
Yeah, I think there's a multiple of challenges facing oil and gas companies. Certainly, stranded assets is definitely a problem. And that's been highlighted by a number of financial investors. So that term is well known in industry and well known in the investment community, and people are certainly aware of it. I think the oil companies' probably biggest risk is market decline. The market's going to shrink, and the market shrinks non-linearly. So if you have a 10% shrink in the market, you may have a 30% reduction in price. And then it comes down to, well, which oil and gas companies have the greatest exposure? And generally, what you see is that the national oil companies usually have access to the lowest lifting rates. So as oil price drops, they're less financially squeezed than the international oil companies. And generally, they are developing the more riskier deep water, the tar sands, the very high capital intensive, very risky projects, very difficult to develop, and they have the highest lifting costs. So you can imagine a combination of a shrinking market, consolidation market, and an attack on the margin. That's what's facing all companies is that existential risk, really, as they're going out of business as the market shrinks. So that's what I see. And you can't really hedge that. And there will be market consolidation. That's inevitable. You'll see larger companies buying up smaller companies to become even larger and somewhat insulate themselves from the downturn, but it's inevitable. So
Let's just begin by dissecting the simple energy model. State capture and technological success is insufficient. You've argued powerfully that delays in the clean energy transition are overwhelmingly political in origin, not technological, because the building blocks are already commercially available. The overlooked layer. You use a mental model, political, policy, and physical, and argue that many people in the clean tech space over-focus on socio-technical issues, missing the politics of power. For our audience, explain what the political layer actually encompasses and why is it the guiding influence?
I think that we share a sort of silver bullet bias. We think somehow the technical revolution going to come. There's some sort of magical formula that will allow us to keep our existing lifestyle, keep on emitting, and there's some sort of magic technology, and we hang out a hope for that. So we all share that sort of that bias. And as engineers, we think that the solution is going to be of a technical nature. And the politicians will develop policy based on the best technical outcome, the best technological pathway. Whereas what happens in politics, in energy, is too important just for engineering. It's central to economic progress, people's well-being, and it's driven by politics of power. And that's where the power resides, not necessarily with government and with political parties, but the politics resides outside, usually by incumbents. So it's incumbents who exert a great deal of influence on public policy. So those are people who are very keen to maintain business as usual. So this is not a conspiracy type theory. This is just a reality. Is once an industry has been around for a long time, it develops a lot of political capital through various means, and that tends to drive policy. So it's understanding where the power lies, who holds the power, and for whose power is it exercised and for whose benefit. And that's very important to understand if you're trying to bring about change. So you've got to be knocking on the right doors. You've got to recognize how change is going to come about. And that's very important. So understanding that where power resides is all integral to that theory of change.
State capture and rent seeking. You define state capture as narrow interest groups taking control of public policy. Given your insider knowledge, how does this process manifest physically? Is it lobbying or does it involve subtle mechanisms like influencing the technical skill and capacity of the public service?
Traditionally, there's three areas that people identify state capture with, and one is political donations. So large companies make political donations to political parties in order to exert influence. So that's a very common thing. It happens in the States, happens all around the world. And I think it's been demonstrated as being a very effective investment. So there's political donations, there's lobbying. That's in the States, we've got uncontrolled lobbying happening in Australia. We're a bit slow to catch on, but now we've caught on. We're going out with some gusto. So that's lobbying groups who are desiring a very specific outcome where a particular policy will favor their individual company or industry. And the other area historically has been what we call revolving doors. So people leave industry, they'll join government, they'll leave and join a lobby group. Then they'll go back to government as media advisors, and there's a kind of revolving door where the company's influence extends into public policy. And then again, you also have much more subtle things going on where historically the public service would be the people to recommend policy to the politicians and looked at it and said, that's great public policy, we're going to exert it, or we'll enact that. What happens now is the politicians are telling public services, this is the policy. And it flies in the face of all rational analysis, but it's politically attractive to exercise a particular policy. So, and that influence, and energy is the one that seems to attract the most attention from the politics of power perspective.
The Salami Slice strategy. In Western Australia, criticized the low-key salami slice approach to transition funding, avoiding public commitment to a costed plan. Why does this political strategy designed to avoid attack fundamentally undermine investor confidence and drive up the cost of capital for private renewable projects?
I'm not sure if this is unique to Western Australia, but it's certainly a feature of the Western Australian political scene. Generally, when you undertake a major change in industrial policy, it's plan-led. You don't normally use a market to exercise a fundamental change in industrial policy, going from coal to oil or from oil and gas to renewables. That sort of plan is generally government-led and invested, and you set out a strategy to say, well, this is why we're doing it, and this is what's required, and there's a substantial amount of public money goes into that to build critical infrastructure. Then that attracts private investment. So you develop confidence that the government is going to spend typically 30%, and then 70% comes from private capital. And you develop investor confidence in that you've got a plan, and it's set out and it's all been budgeted for, and everyone's aware of what's involved. That de-risks investment, and that lowers the cost of capital. And I'm not sure, the renewable energy projects are very sensitive to the cost of capital because their upfront capital costs are quite high, well, relative, and then the operating costs are very low because they've got no fuel costs. So the cost of capital is a major driver in the economics. So if you're an international renewable energy company and you look around the world where to place investment, what you want is a location where the government's policy is very clear and they've set out steps to impart a multi-year program with necessarily support to industry as required. But the problem in WA with that particular approach is what ministers tell us offline is that makes them a big target for the opposition. And the opposition is not a political opposition. Those are not in political opposition. The opposition is those in industry and in the media, and so where the power lies, and by making themselves a big target by having a big plan. So the idea is to try and make yourself a small target and have a small plan. So that makes it politically expedient, but at the same time, it lowers investor confidence and drives up cost of capital.
You're a professional director. If governments lose the capacity to be the responsible stewards of the public good by letting the market dictate critical infrastructure, what happens to the overall national economic stability?
That's a tricky question, Ali, and it depends on where your personal politics lie. And some people take the view that markets solve all problems, and some people think that essential infrastructure should be held by government. So it really depends on what your view is. The difficulty happens is where you get stuck in between. Your plan requires private capital to come in to exercise a transition, but you haven't made this public funding available to build essential infrastructure that's state-owned. So if it's a state-owned infrastructure, then it's incumbent on the government to do the investment to allow it to transition. The other alternative is to deregulate and sell those assets to private industry. But what we've seen, and that's what happened in the East Coast in Australia, there's less state-owned assets there than there is on the West Coast. So we think from a market model, we think our model should be easy to execute a transition, but that's not what's happening in practice because the government doesn't want to put the full funding up for it. So it's an interesting question, Ali, and it's what happens is as a result, you have delay, uncertainty, then you're vulnerable to increases in energy costs. So those are, in any transition or any energy system, you look for three things. The trilemma is energy security, energy affordability, and environmental impacts. Those are the three things that any energy minister around the world...
Let's address the inevitable resistance. You argue Woodside or Chevron to become the next Worsted is a fantasy. The business model constraint detail the key business drivers, the reserve replacement ratio, and monetizing undeveloped reserves that structurally prevent the fossil fuels companies from embracing the transition? Why is generating renewable energy fundamentally incompatible with their core financial models?
I think it comes down to a couple of things which we've witnessed, Ali. Different oil companies have dabbled in renewable energy over 25, 30 years. Some have been in it for a long time, some have been in it for a short time. It comes down to capital allocation and investor expectations on returns. So, and what drives an oil company is reserves replacement. If you're producing and you're not replacing the reserves, then what that signals to investors is that they're looking for future returns. So if you keep investing on developing new reserves, then that indicates future revenue. And once you've discovered reserves, but you haven't developed them, they sit on your balance sheet as an asset. And it's an incumbent on you to realize that asset value. So what really drives the oil companies, and there's really two different businesses. Oil companies they develop energy reserves, and that generates a certain return. The renewable energy industry is a utility business, and that generates much smaller returns. It's generally, all companies generate 35% returns. A utility business is 8 to 10%. So it's actually a different type of business. That's why you find that all companies aren't vertically integrated from reserves into a power systems. They generally, as a rule, they're not vertically integrated. There is some exception, vertically integrated, because they're really two different businesses and they're best executed by different companies. So it's a fundamental business model, and also from investors' perspective, you're seeing capital flight from energy companies who decide to go down the renewable energy route. They've been punished. Their share price has been punished by shareholders, and shareholders probably say, look, we want you to be an oil company. That's why I invested in you. If I want to invest in a renewable energy company, I'll invest in a renewable energy company that knows how to generate those returns. So basically two different businesses. And energy companies like Chevron and Woodside, they're actually oil and gas companies. They're not energy companies. They changed the names in the 90s to make it more attractive to the community. But that's not their business. The business is not energy, it is oil and gas.
The returns gap, you talked a little bit about it. You contrast the fossil fuel companies' 25 to 30% returns in a good cycle with utilities about 10%. Why is this difference in shareholder expectations the ultimate break that forces fossil fuel companies to pull back from renewables, as Shell's successor did?
I think we've witnessed fairly recently both BP and Shell and Total to an extent that when they've made announcements that they're going to develop a renewable energy business, shareholders punish them by selling off and investing in pure play oil and gas companies like Exxon Mobil and Chevron. So they've gone and said, right, that's what our shareholders want. We'll change the CEO and we'll come up with a new strategy, and we'll ditch the renewable energy part of our business and stick with core business.
The hydrogen distraction. You label hydrogen a marvelous distraction. What allows continued burning of hydrocarbons? That allows the continued burning of hydrocarbons. From a technical standpoint, why is the extremely low energy efficiency 20% round trip of hydrogen transport and use a fatal economic flaw that the weight of lobbying spin is currently overweighing?
So hydrogen hype comes and goes. If you've been in the industry long enough, you've seen previous hypes, hydrogen bubbles come and go and burst. From an engineering and thermodynamics perspective, hydrogen as a fuel doesn't really make a lot of sense. If you look at the 100 million tons of hydrogen that's generated around the world at the moment, it's generated and consumed in situ. It's not actually transported around the world as an energy vector. So the idea, it's a silver bullet bias that we think about. So somehow we can have this super clean fuel that we burn it only generates water vapor, and we can make it from super cheap renewable energy. We can liquefy it, we can stick it on tankers, and we can sell it to Japan, and we oil and gas out, hydrogen in. It's a suitable replacement. But unfortunately, the economics of it dictate that hydrogen as a fuel is a non-starter. What it has done is captured people's attention, which means that, okay, hydrogen is just around the corner. So in the meantime, we can keep burning oil and gas. So that's why it's a marvelous distraction.
Yeah, it's very convenient for the molecule industry, the fossil.
Yeah.
The partner lie. FFCs have shifted the narrative from gas as a transition fuel to gas as a partner for renewable energy. How is this subtle shift in language designed to obscure the reality that gas's true function is only to be a low capacity factor backup for the final 5 to 10% of a 100% renewable system?
Yeah, the oil and gas industry still wants to see itself as being vital. It has been for 150 years, and it's not going to give up that mantle. So very keen to time their position will shift, and what they don't want to be seen as to be anti-renewables. So they're saying renewables is great, but it's weather variable, it's intermittent, and you need gas to firm it up. So gas is a partner, and a partner sounds like a marriage. It's a long-term commitment, whereas in reality, it's a transition fuel, and it's a fuel that's used less and less in the transition. As better technology comes along, like battery technology, and is increasing rapidly, and the cost curve is reducing very rapidly. So batteries making large inroads into areas where historically gas peakers power stations were used, and now batteries can perform that function quicker and cheaper than gas. So gas has been slowly edged out of the system, the same way as rooftop solar edged coal out of the system. Batteries will edge gas out of the system. So that challenge facing oil and gas companies. And from a societal perspective, one of the biggest challenges, actually, we need to manage supply during the transition. That's the challenge, Ali. We can't turn it off tomorrow. It needs to turn off, but how do we manage that transition? Ramping up is easy. Ramping down is actually very hard. So that's the challenge. We've got to recognize it, especially in Western Australia. We don't have access to pumped hydro to provide long duration energy storage, whereas in the US and other countries, you'll have access to it. So we're relying on gas in a chemical energy as a long duration energy storage. A challenge unique to our particular, so every context is going to be different. All of gas is on the way out as something better, quicker, and cheaper and cleaner in the form of storage comes into play.
He's talking to one of the co-authors of Stellar by Rethink X, and he was saying that it's cheap now, down to 1 cent per kilowatt hour. You should just overbuild solar to the worst day in winter, and then have all year long have abundant energy, and the only use battery for like time or a few days storage, not for the long-term winter storage. For that, you just overbuild solar to such an extent that you don't need any long-term storage. You don't need pump or some other kind of flow batteries.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge, Ali, is as engineers, we're inherently conservative, and we like to build models to simulate things. So, and whilst some technology people focus on the technology, we like to focus on the problem and understand what the problem looks like. And so in Western Australia, we've done the modeling, and we can understand what the actual limits of solar does have at limits. Okay. With batteries, you can extend the limits, and with wind, you can extend it even further. But there's times necessarily in 1 year, it could be every decade where you have a challenge. You have to look at interseasonal, interannual, and interdecadal weather forecasting to understand that you'll have coincidence of low solar radiation and low wind production, and your batteries will be discharged, and you need another form of bulk energy generation. So as it's less and less, but it doesn't go away. And the key thing is, if you have large-scale renewables, you need large-scale backup. That will never go away. You may not use that backup, you may not use it for 5 years, but there'll come a time when you actually need it. And that presents some interesting challenges. Almost impossible to overbuild a system to eliminate that. It just becomes prohibitively expensive. You can overbuild by a factor of 3 or 4, but then comes a classic case of diminishing returns. Cost comes down, then it starts to go back up again.
Well, he says significantly overbuild, and whenever you have excess energy, you can do things like desalination with that excess energy.
Yeah,
there's no time constraint for it.
Yeah, certainly lots of opportunities in that area. You just have to be a little bit careful. People who are designing and operating the system tend to be more conservative than to adopt that, and you need that. To be more effusive about their technology and about what can happen. You need people conservative who are actually operating infrastructure. So yeah, certainly solar cost curve keeps going down, performance increases. Get solar who you can get output on cloudy days with behind the meter storage, battery storage, those costs reducing. It means that you can extend solar into the nighttime, so you can shift that energy, and that's transformational. Transformational.
I just saw something that CATL is dropping prices for LFP by 40%. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Solar, you keep hearing all these advances that solar keeps getting better and cost keeps coming down.
Yeah. It's definitely on the right track, where you can't say that necessarily for wind, and you can't say that for nuclear. Cost curves are somewhat different, but solar is like a commodity. It's like a washing machine or a car. You're selling millions of units. You look at what's happened in Pakistan. I think they had 50% of their grid capacity by rooftop solar in the pace of about between 12 and 18 months. It's absolutely incredible. So yeah,
it's distributed, so it makes the grid more stable, because grid breaks somewhere, it doesn't mean that it breaks for everybody. They have their own power in their own neighborhood. There's power because
one thing we're going to need when climate change impacts is resilience at a community level. So absolutely right, Ali. Is energy model is inherently bust from a resilience perspective. Yeah.
What happened in Jamaica, their whole infrastructure is wiped out. But if people have solar and battery, whoever has solar and battery is still good.
Yep, absolutely.
The day after the storm is over, they don't have to worry about the grid. Now let's turn to advocacy, activism, and moving the dial.
Mm-hmm.
You transitioned from activist to advocate. You roles well. The moral limit. You state the moral imperative argument will not influence fossil fuel companies who are bound by law to shareholders, not morals. But it works to starve them of talent and erode their social license. For our audience, what specific action to take in this moral withdrawal?
Yeah, quite challenging. And must admit, it's an area, as an ex-oil and gas person, I feel a little bit comfortable about my ex-colleagues in the industry to such pressure. Don't for the industry, because the industry acts in ways that are counter to societal survival. And the oil company, look, climate change is real. Burning fossil fuels is damaging the climate. These companies cannot keep doing it. That moral argument, not one that directors are required to take a full account of. Back to that argument as well, what else will they do? They really forced to double down on being an oil and gas company. So then individuals within the companies then need to make a decision they want to stay in the industry or not, or whether service companies, insurance companies, advertising companies, accounting, want to continue supporting the oil companies, and they need to make that decision themselves. I wouldn't want to say they're doing anything wrong by doing it, but I think they need to understand that their support continues industry to propagate, and it slows down the energy transition. They have to sort of realize that and make a decision for themselves. And a number of companies have decided to withdraw services from oil and gas companies. And that decision that they and the employees need to make, and I applaud it, but I wouldn't be campaigning as an activist to do that. Would see my skills better placed in an advocacy role, if that makes sense, Ali.
Interviewed the founder of Sphere. She has a company that offers 401k options in Vanguard, Fidelity, and Schwab, where you can choose a mutual fund. There's low-cost index funds that don't invest in fossil fuels. Companies called Sphere, and they have a ETF, PFF, which completely don't invest in any fossil fuels, tobacco, or firearms or weapons. So people who want to choose not to invest, and as the flows of money decreases towards fossil fuel companies, as well as she was telling me that the overall returns in the last 20 years or 25 years for fossil fuel companies have been far lower than the rest of S&P 500. And at some point, there'll be massive tobacco industry face all these lawsuits and of the damage that they're doing. Liabilities coming, as well as their assets would be stranded. And as coastal communities go underwater, people are going to sue them for damages that they lost their livelihood. The entire city of Houston in 100 years will go under. And I bet those people are going to sue the fossil fuel companies, try to get some reparations.
Definitely. Capital flight, talent flight, license. They're all challenges and challenging the courts. These are all issues that the oil companies are facing, and it's only going to ramp up. So it's a very tough road ahead for them. Tide is definitely turning, Ali, and I think once the politicians realize that there's sufficient capital community, then they'll start to distance themselves from the oil companies. It's going to happen overnight, but you will see a change.
Politicians will, at some point, when there's all these lawsuits and all these disasters all over the world, people who start coming after these oil companies, then things will change. As well as it is now 60% electric cars. Nepal is 70% electric cars, and the uptake of electric cars globally is happening rapidly.
Yeah, it's not a linear change, Ali. That's the other thing, is that changes can be exponential. Seeing that uptake of rooftop solar, and you'll see it with the uptake of EVs. It doesn't happen linear. It happens exponential.
Beyond EVs, I was in Las Vegas in September for RE Plus 2025, and that's the week that Amazon Zook started debuting their pods. And there's 200,000 robocabs rides per week, and the Chinese equivalent does 250,000. And Waymo is going to double their cities next year in just about a month, and they're coming to even more cities. So at that point, people won't even own cars. There won't be cars. Yeah. So it's cost, and electric cars is the lowest cost option. So there will be no car companies. There will be no gas stations. Gas stations are closing in Norway and in China, just the beginning.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's the travel. And the advantage now is that all electric options, whether it's home electrification or rooftop solar, or whether it's transport, generally now a better technology and a life cycle perspective, the lower cost. So win these things on an economic argument, not a environmental argument. So on an EV, you realize, hey, this is better technology. The stage didn't end because we ran out of stove. We'll move on from the fossil fuel era because we discovered better technology.
Yeah, and it's starting to become cheaper than ICE cars in many markets. And it's just the beginning.
Yep.
Moving the dial, a crisis often produces real change. In the absence of a crisis, how do advocates effectively move the dial? Is it more effective to use the embarrassing the government method, or to lobbying for specific technical market changes?
That comes down to analysis of particular context. We know in Western Australia is that there's a lot of competition between states, and I'm possibly sure that's the same in America, is that state has an incentive, for example, or a rebate scheme or something, some program that's been successful, and we can demonstrate that our state is left behind because here's another policy that a more progressive government has taken on board and it's been very successful. Quite often you end up embarrassing the government, and they will want to take action. They're looking after their citizens just as well as anyone else. So that's an approach. Effective. Renewable industry hasn't developed necessarily the political sufficiently that capability, but incumbents, imagine they've had 150 years to develop their skill set.
And they still have the deep pockets.
Exactly. They still got the deep pockets. And why you'll see is advertising budgets of these companies are through the roof. Time to be in advertising because lots of fossil fuel related advertising coming out. So, yeah.
You got off for a second.
Yeah.
If you can hear me now.
Hear you now, yep.
The user pays model in Western Australia for driving up costs. The US Inflation Reduction Act uses subsidies to de-risk private capital. If you could implement one core policy to de-risk investment and accelerate the transition in Australia, would you use the IRA model or a different government-led mechanism?
I mean, the Reduction Act was a very clever piece of legislation because it was centered on the idea that renewable is inherently, it actually reduces inflation, and everyone of your political stripes can sign up to it. So they can sign up to reducing inflation, living pressures. So that's quite a clever policy. If I was to adopt one policy to enable the transition, it would be funding common user infrastructure to enable the energy transition. So it would be looking at strategic industrial areas and renewable energy zones, and making sure that the process covered the entire renewable energy zone. So you obtain the approvals, you do the flora and fauna studies, you do the wind resourcing studies, you do all those studies, and you sell those to developers, and the developers will then understand that they can invest in confidence and to known timelines, because basically it's laid out. It's like having an industrial area where all the services are provided. You see where you're going to put your industrial unit, and everything's there for you. You can go, right, okay, well, this is going to be easy. I just need to build a shed, get my industry up and going. All the services are there. Yep, I've got to pay for them, but I know what I'm paying. And my business model, you've done the economic modeling, you can build your case for the investors, and it's all straightforward. So that would be my view, would be to the common infrastructure investment. So, it's up for the next 50, 100 years of economic prosperity by funding it now.
You conclude that the fight continues. What gives you, after decades in the trenches, fighting against such entrenched, well-funded political power, the personal motivation and optimism to keep going?
One is I know that as an engineer, I know it's a better option. It works. It's not selling something that's not going to work. So it's a better option. And there's not really any other alternative. There's a very limited opportunity, different for generating energy. And renewable energy is the cheapest and cleanest and quickest to deploy. So it's that, and the interaction with community. We do a lot of community events. We talk to lots of people in the community, and we hear their feedback. Very enthusiastic, and they're actually very knowledgeable about energy, and they're very passionate about needing to do something about climate change. Everyone's aware of climate change now, and the majority of people want to take action, whether personally or as a community or as a society. They're very keen to action. So having some technical knowledge to enable that to happen and to support your community is what keeps me going. It's really giving back, Ali. I don't have a profit. I'm not volunteers. So we don't earn any money from this. So we're all volunteers. So it's not that we're building a business. We're out supporting the community, and the feedback from the community and their support is what sustains us.
Fraser, this conversation has provided a necessary dose of realism. about the true nature of the energy transition. Thank you for walking us through the politics of power.
Nice to be on your show, Ali.
That's Fraser Maywood, Chair of Sustainable Energy Now. His insights are a critical blueprint for anyone in the clean energy community who wants to be effective. If this conversation empowered you, strategic thinking, hit that like button and subscribe to Clean Titans. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
The insights and solutions we discuss here are crucial for a cleaner future. They're about a fundamental shift in mindset. We believe that interviews like this are so profound, they can change the course of your life. If this conversation moved you, hit that subscribe button to join the community that's building the sustainable future. Thank you for watching. Like and tell your friends about Clean Titans and consider supporting us on Buy Me a Coffee. And we'll see you next time on Clean Titans.